Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Commonwealth Canada Speaker Series. It is my honor to introduce Peter Barnes, our guest speaker today. Peter is an entrepreneur, environmentalist, and a celebrated author who's written a number of books introducing some very important ideas. Ideas like Capitalism 3.0, cap and dividend, and universal property. These ideas have inspired governments, policy experts, and advocates around the world to see the Earth's resources as a commons. The following is a conversation between Peter, myself, and Floyd Marinescu, the founder of Commonwealth Canada, followed by a Q&A with members of our community. I hope you'll find this talk as informative and insightful as we have.
Income can come from two sources, or three sources, really. It can come from labor. You can be paid for labor. You can get money from government through one program or another, or you can get income from property. And what I'm trying to do with the concept of universal property is to introduce a kind of new way of thinking about basic income, which is that a lot of it, if not all of it, could actually flow from property rights as opposed to from government programs that are funded by taxes. And these would be universal property rights that would belong equally to everybody. We would all be born owning these property rights. And they could take many forms. There's no one size fits all. But the thing about property rights is that they are, first of all, they're in a sense immortal. I mean, I'm overstating it, but once they're created, they last forever, essentially, and they can be passed from one generation to the next. And they also come with a lot of power, the power to say how, whatever the asset that the property right is attached to, if you have that property right, you can control how that asset is used. You can say it can't be used at all. You can say it can be used a little bit. You can charge people who use it and generate some income. So property is a powerful tool. And what I am suggesting is that common wealth, which is all around us and immense and a potentially vast source of revenue for basic income, it's missing something right now. And what it's missing is property rights. And I'm not talking about, private ownership property rights. I'm talking about common ownership property rights, but they are property rights. And once they are established, they're in there indefinitely, and they can give the property owners, i.e. all of us, the power to limit use, exclude use, allow a certain amount of use, and so forth. So in order to really manage common wealth, I mean, we have two choices, really. One, let the state manage it, or manage it ourselves, so to speak, through various kinds of property rights that are birthrights. You just get a piece of this property when you are born, and that's it. It's non-transferable too. So it's a new way to think about managing commonwealth, limiting use, which we probably often want to do, and also generating income from it, which is then equally shared, and setting that up in such a way that once it's established, it can't be taken away. So that's the idea behind universal property, to start thinking about another source of revenue for basic income that isn't based on taxes. And I should just add that you guys as Canadians might not think along these lines as much as I do, being an American, because unfortunately in America, we have a political system which is, it's not trustworthy. And it's not that it's not trustworthy, it's that it's fickle. And one year they pass something and then 5 years later they repeal it. So the idea of having a basic income depend upon the political winds and the whims of our elected leaders makes me a little nervous. I am attracted to the idea of property rights because once they're set up, that's it. They're property rights, they endure forever. So that's my thought about universal property. I lost your sound. Is there something wrong?
Sorry. Yeah, I believe in your books you were talking about universal property coming from co-inherited wealth. What are some examples of co-inherited wealth?
Well, the biggest ones, there are a lot of them, but the biggest ones where the most money resides are the atmosphere, which is something that's never been propertized before, and polluters just dumping it for free with no limits. Land is another. Obviously, you guys have focused on land, and I read Henry George 50 years ago, and I totally get the idea of land value and land tax. But the third that I have lately been very interested in is our monetary system and our money supply. These are not natural assets. They are socially created assets, but they rightfully belong to all of us. The money supply exists because basically government or central bank prints new money, gives it to banks, banks lend it out, blah, blah, blah. That's how new money gets created. In the old days, it used to be called seigniorage, when the kings would mint money and all the benefits of that minted money would go to the kings, for their armies and whatnot. So in a democracy, you would think that seigniorage should belong to everybody, not to the private banks. So when I was writing the book that Bill and Hillary Clinton were holding up, With Liberty and Dividends for All, I spent a lot of time kind of looking at various pieces of commonwealth or universal property that would generate revenue. And I didn't focus on land, but the two biggest among the ones that I focused on were the atmosphere and the money system. They're both really rich deposits of untapped wealth that could be turned into dividends for everybody.
We're going to go deeper into some of these ideas, but as I mentioned, that a lot of the audience here is from a basic income background. Can you clarify that you see these two concepts existing together? But I think you had an article about a guaranteed basic income or means-tested benefits layered on top of social dividends. And why do you think we need both, or one or the other is maybe not enough?
Well, these are more sort of practical political questions than they are theoretical questions. But obviously, practical politics is important. In the U.S., we have, at the moment, we have a system for, well, what we used to call welfare, which is tax revenue distributed to, quote, needy people, as the government defines it and redefines it from time to time. So that's one system. We also have social insurance, where people contribute, employers contribute, and eventually, if they live long enough, they get money at the end of life. That's an insurance system that is another way to distribute income. It only works for people at the end of life, however, because obviously if you have to make contributions before you get income, you can't start getting income until late in life. So I'm thinking of commonwealth dividends as a third stool or third leg in the stool of non-labor income streams. And that's an important concept too. Everybody, knows about labor income, and they think that that's the only legitimate source of income for most people. What we're saying is there's a second legitimate source of income for all people, which comes from their share of commonwealth. So think of that three-legged stool again, and maybe this doesn't apply so much in Canada, I don't know, but you've got social insurance, you've got tax-based welfare that is always need-based. You always have to go through all sorts of hoops to get any of that money, and it can easily be cut off, and Congress can change its mind at any moment. So it's not really a secure source of income for most people. And then to the third leg would be dividends from universal property or commonwealth. So those would be the three sources of non-labor income that would complement labor income.
I might have lost Peter for a few seconds there.
Yeah. Okay, you're back, Peter. Sorry, we lost the last 10 seconds. Three sources of non-labor income. Yeah.
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 Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
A three-legged stool, an image of a three-legged stool, three sources of non-labor income, one of which would be dividends from commonwealth, another would be welfare, and third might be social insurance.
So we would need a guaranteed basic income, right, layered on top of social dividends, because I think in your book you mentioned that you foresee dividends from commonwealth perhaps topping out at around $8,000 per year per person, which is obviously not enough to make to eliminate poverty.
Yeah, well, I think there's potentially more money in the bucket for basic income based on commonwealth. So that $8,000 figure was just somewhat random, but my thinking behind that was, people are always saying, oh, we can't afford this. So I wanted to come out with a reasonable number and also not claim that this would be the only source of non-labor income. I was not thinking of abolishing any existing sources of non-labor income because, hey, we got them, let's keep them, and let's either add on or put a base under them and lift the whole thing up. That was my thinking.
Right. Okay. Part of my own journey in the basic income movement and coming to ideas like yourselves and Guy Standing, who also talks about creating commons capital funds, sovereign wealth funds, which you talk about, which we'll get into. The sources of these funds seem to have their own source of justice and reform. Like, just as much as we want to reduce poverty with giving people money, where the money comes from seems to be as big and even in some ways bigger reforms, if you're talking about creating universal property, than even giving people the money. And I'm curious to hear if you talk a bit about that. For instance, in Canada, we have carbon rebates, which are justified based on pollution, and that idea comes in large part from you with the cap and dividend.
Right.
And looking at other reforms, like you're talking about, central bank money. We talk in your book, you mentioned, I love this idea of make oligopolies pay.
Yeah.
So for Canadians, imagine if we all know Bell and Rogers are oligopoly. Imagine if some shares of Bell and Rogers, which is the cell phone companies, were in a fund that gave us all dividends because they're monopolists. It seems like these reforms are even bigger challenges some ways than the idea that we should have an income floor. Even bigger challenges somehow. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, well, there are so many challenges out there. It's hard to know which ones to pick. I mean, there's the theoretical world and then there's the real political world, and there's a wide gap between them. We in California have a sort of statewide cap and dividend program, except it's been so twisted by the private utilities that people don't actually get a check. They get a credit against their utility bill, which nobody even notices. So anyway, I'm trying to focus on one part of your question, which I think is various ways that might fit together to create enough money to pay basic income dividends. In other words,
It
I think
seems that the
somewhere,
sources of funding are
yeah,
almost a bigger reform than the idea of giving people money. Like a much bigger political challenge even than the idea of redistribution. And
right.
and you must have run into that in your career because you promoted cap and dividend. Yeah, I'm just curious if you had just any commentary on that.
Well,
Mm.
it is a real problem. Uh, there is a lack of appreciation in America. I don't know so much about Canada, but the idea that people could, quote, get money for nothing, for not working, is such an alien idea that it's almost the first thing we have to confront and overcome. Uh, I don't know how to do that. That is really challenging. But I mean, my hypothesis was that if we talk about property rights, if you ask people in Alaska why they are getting their dividend, they will say it's because we're getting it out of oil, and oil was nature's gift to all of us. So there is, I think, the capacity for even dim-witted Americans to understand that there is stuff that belongs to all of us that can generate revenue, which we are entitled to, not because we've worked for it, but because it's a property that belongs to all of us. So, but in reality, you know, when you think about how the Alaska Permanent Fund came to be, it was kind of a political fluke. It depended, of course, first of all, upon the discovery of a massive amount of oil relative to the population of the state. And you may have similar phenomena in Alberta and other places like that. So there was that, but there was also the fortuitous fact that a guy named Jay Hammond, a Republican, was governor at the time that the oil was discovered, and he was kind of a populist Republican of the kind we don't see very much anymore, who came up with this idea of sharing the revenue equally and preserving it. That was all. That was why it was called the Permanent Fund, because they didn't want to they had the foresight to see that, you know, if you just dug it all up and, you know, spend it all at once, the state would be left eventually in poverty. So this was a way to preserve permanently the wealth that nature had endowed Alaska with. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So on the note of preservation, you mentioned in your book that markets can actually protect the environment. We can have markets serve the social fabric of society, and you give some methods of having local trusts that have property rights, control over things like lakes or forests. And yeah, for assuming a lot of the audience doesn't know this idea, can you kind of explain a bit what that would look like? How could markets protect nature and all of that contribute into dividends?
Okay, well, you know, I should preface my answer by saying that I kind of got into basic income through the back door, because I started off thinking about climate change and realized that there was this enormous market flaw that was behind the ultimate cause of climate change, was that nobody owned the atmosphere. And if we could establish common ownership of the atmosphere, limit use, charge for use, make polluters pay, which is the best, well, limits and fees are the two tools that are essential for reducing pollution. But then what do you do with the revenue? Ooh, and how big is the revenue? Ooh, the revenue could be huge. And ironically, the faster we lower the cap in a system like that, the more revenue you get, because it's sort of like OPEC. You drive up prices by creating scarcity. So there you have a win-win situation where the faster you fight climate change by reducing the cap in carbon emissions, the more money we all get. So that was how I kind of got into this. And then afterwards, I began seeing there are other similar arrangements that could be made with other pieces of commonwealth. And when you start putting them all together, you get a more diverse portfolio of revenue sources, and something that could actually put out a significant amount of money, 8,000, whatever, but there's a lot of potential money there. And the thought being that once people start, it's a hard idea to sell in the abstract. That was the point I was trying to make about Alaska. If you had just started off trying to sell the idea of income from Commonwealth or oil, it might be a hard sell. But fortunately, they had Jay Hammond in there. He did it. Then once the dividends started, people began to get it, and it became enormously popular. In a way, I think that's kind of the way we're going to have to work on the larger scale in the US and Canada. It's hard for people to just get it in the abstract, but if they start getting checks that they can see, as opposed to utility credits that they can't see, they can begin to understand why they're getting that money, where it's coming from, and feel okay about it. Because it's their equal share of all this wealth that we co-inherit.
Yeah, and in Canada, I mean, to that note, the carbon rebate was not sold as your share of pollution.
Right.
It was more of an after issue, that this is how we're going to reduce the financial damage on the population who is paying the tax, with the promise that I believe 90% of the carbon tax income would be recirculated.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. It's that it's and also recently, to the point about the credit, I was also kind of upset that the carbon rebate was a tax credit, and because I remember Jay Hammond saying that no one noticed it when it was a credit. They had to actually get a check in the mail. So this year, the Liberal government in Canada started issuing the carbon. It's called the Climate Action Incentive. Everyone on this call must probably seen it in your bank account, or maybe you got a check in the mail. So now it comes to us directly as an advance, as opposed to something you deal with at tax time. So yeah, I really hope that raises awareness and voters connect to it more. I wish it was called something more relevant than Climate Action Incentive. It sounds like you're, I don't know how to take those words.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, but it's from the book that you mentioned having networks of trusts that have control over certain natural resources. And can you talk a bit more about that? Like, do you mean like there could be a Lake Ontario trust that you have to pay, and then it contributes its revenue upwards to the fund, or how would that look?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you start with the idea that ecosystems are assets, both, biological assets and financial assets, then you think about, well, how would you manage it? It's not, you wouldn't put a private corporation in charge of it. You might put government in charge of it, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm a little skeptical of the long-term trustability of government. So a third option would be to create a trust and put the asset under the management of this not-for-profit trust, whose trustees have a fiduciary obligation to future generations. So their sole mission is to preserve the asset for the benefit of future generations. And if they deviate from that mission or that financial duty, they can be sued. So you have an enforcement mechanism that actually binds in the duty to future generations, as well as to living generations equally through the dividend process. If you just do it through government, you have no guarantees, you have no trustees, no fiduciary duty. You're just subject to the whims of politics. So the idea of trusts is kind of key to my vision. And then, so what would the trust be? Ecosystems can be, air basins. They can be lakes. They can be watersheds. They can be forests. They can be wetlands. There's sort of no limit really to it's whatever you define as an ecosystem, which is a gift of nature to all of us. And then So you have a trust, you have a board of trustees, and the asset has to be defined in some way so that anybody, and a sort of a fence put around it, so that any private user that either dumps crap into it or takes stuff out of it has to get a permit and pay a fee. So that's the basic structure that both protects natural gifts and generates revenue to pay dividends, and is kind of secure against political wind shifting.
It'd be pretty decentralized as well.
It would
Lots
be
of things.
decentralized, yes.
Yeah.
And it would be kind of built from the bottom up too. I mean, some of it, like a national air trust, for example, you have to pass national legislation. And but a lot of it could be built from the bottom up. Just the way you go out and you incorporate a private corporation. I could imagine that if you've got a lake in your neighborhood area, you could incorporate a trust to protect the lake. It would have to be, you know, chartered by the state, but once it was chartered, it would run itself.
Wow. I think we need a space trust. There's all satellites
Yeah, that
there.
too.
And yeah. So in your book, you mentioned 3 types of, I think you call them pumps, money pumps, or forms of universal property, as a way to kind of get to this vision faster. You mentioned the creation of a social wealth fund based on co-inherited wealth.
Yeah.
Which we've talked about a bit in these calls. A universal inheritance fund that's linked to an inheritance tax, and finally electronically minted money by the central bank. I wonder if you want to talk a bit more about these ideas, and so the audience understands your vision.
Okay, well, imagine like an Alaska Permanent Fund or some large fund set up where into which you wanted to have multiple revenue streams, and out of which you get the universal dividends. So we've talked about getting revenue from natural assets that are held in trust. So that would be one source. Then you mentioned the I don't know what you call it. The what?
Make oligopolies pay.
Oh, well, that's another one. Yes. Yeah. I mean, if you can't fight or outlaw monopolies, at least take some of the monopoly rent and recycle it back to the people. That was the theory behind that idea. I didn't include it in my calculations, but it's a worthy idea if anybody wants to pursue it. I think the other things I mentioned were this every baby trust fund, baby, you know, where the inheritance tax goes into a fund, not into the general treasury as it now does, but into a special fund that is used, then distributed equally to every child born within that year. So that deals with starting gate inequality, which is an important part of the, you know, inequality problem. And then a social wealth fund based on corporate taxes, or corporate stock, I should say. I think this was James Mead's idea, and it was the model in Sweden, the short-lived model of the so-called Meidner funds, where corporations every year were required to pay, in addition to regular taxes that went to the government, they were required to give like 1% per year of their shares of stock into kind of like a pension fund for their workers. And over time, that pension fund would actually own a large percentage of the corporate stock. And it wouldn't be company by company, it would be sort of collective. And the end result would be another large revenue source for basic dividends. I think those were, and then the central bank money was the last one that I mentioned, which is ripe, my God, ripe for, it's money that's there for the taking, and every year trillions of dollars are just handed out free to private banks who then lend them and earn the interest. So that is there was a great book that I just would reference by Robert Hockett called, I think it was called Money for Free, but this was a guy who used to work for the Fed, totally understands how that game works, and said this is a much better way to introduce new money into the economy. There always has to be a certain amount of money, new money added to the economy every year just to keep things going. This would be the better way to do it rather than giving it for free to banks.
Wow. Well, the Canadians experienced during the pandemic, the CERB, which was $2,000 a month for a limited time.
Really?
That was unfortunately still following the kind of masquerade about buying central bank, buying government bonds in order to pay CERB. It could have been done directly to people without the whole charade about the bonds.
Yeah.
But not sure it would have made much difference in terms of obviously the benefits, but in terms of just printing money directly to people. That's very interesting and very controversial, since we've all been programmed to not think about printing money. Yeah, you must have thought of that. How would you respond to someone saying that, hey, printing money is crazy, you cause inflation, it's just nuts.
Yeah, no, there are ways to deal with that. I mean, Hockett talks about that. He I think proposes either 1,000 or 2,000 a month paid by the Fed directly to every citizen. But the Fed, as you know, the supreme authority of the money supply, would also have, if inflation became an issue, then the Fed would have the right to require that the money that was given out be put in a time deposit rather than spent immediately. So the citizen would still get the money, they just couldn't spend it right away. But I think that's an elegant way to address this scare issue about inflation.
Yeah, it's interesting. So less money to the private banks, more money to people, but people's credit worthiness would increase because they have a stable income source.
Of course.
So loans would be easier to give anyway.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Actually, you mentioned James Mead. He mentioned the idea of social wealth funds as a way to reduce inequality and deal with automation of jobs.
Yeah.
And one of his ideas was, I like to colloquially call it print money and buy assets, like just buy shares, buy stuff, and put it in a sovereign wealth fund as a way so that people have this common wealth. Curious what you think about this idea.
I love it. It's basically what I was suggesting earlier, the Swedish model, where you just require the corporations to put stock in the fund. You could print money and buy the stock and put it in the fund, similar. They're all good.
And Sam Altman from OpenAI also proposed a 2.5% share tax on large companies that would go into a fund that pays people.
Love it.
As a way of sharing in the proceeds from artificial intelligence.
Yeah, there's no one right way to do any of this stuff. There are multiple possibilities. That, I think, is the key point we're getting across. But I think underlying all the various possibilities, I mean, you could think of them one at a time as just individual policies, or you could think of them sort of collectively as a process of capturing commonwealth and sharing it. I mean, it amounts to the same thing. It's more a political question of how you go about selling this.
How would you position universal property or commonwealth relative to wealth inequality? I mean, it seems obvious, but I'd like to hear in your words. I mean, we have so much extreme wealth inequality, and if we create a big pot that everyone co-owns, would that make a difference?
Well, yes. I mean, I got the phrase universal money pump from a statement that was made by Mariner Eccles, who I'm sure you've never heard of, but he was chair of the US Federal Reserve in the 1930s during the Depression, and he was a big advocate of pumping money as fast as possible out to as many people as possible. But one of the metaphors he used when describing the normal state of capitalism is that it not only starts off with built-in inequality, but it constantly accentuates inequality by pumping money to the top. And we see that everywhere. It's just this upward money pump is an inbuilt feature of capitalism as we know it. So if we're still going to have a market economy, as opposed to everything run by the state, we need to build in sort of a counter pump that pumps money up from the bottom rather than up to the top. And that is my, so universal money pumps and how they could be built, we've talked about various ways they can be built, but that is the feature that is missing really from capitalism as we know it. There are two, I don't know if you've run across the English economist Kate Raworth, who wrote a very interesting book called The Doughnut Economy. And her big metaphor is this image of, okay, you've got the outer part of the donut, which would be the kind of ecological limit to the market economy. You've got an inner circle, which is the social floor, and then the market operates within the donut. So that's a great theory, but how do you actually create an economy that works like that? And so my answers are, well, the outer ecological limit is set by these trusts that we described earlier, and the social floor is it's not just the social floor, but you need that upward recycling mechanism, and that's what protects the social floor, and that is various forms of universal money pumps.
Okay, so as we're reaching the 15 minutes left mark, we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, and I'll ask one last question, or a visionary question, and then we'll go on. And for those who've been to these calls before, you know that the official end is at 3 Eastern, but we'll stay for as long as Peter wants to stay, and that we have questions. And so we have quite a few questions. So my last question is, well, if you imagine a world after universal property, let's say your wildest dreams have been met, like what does it look like? What does it feel like? What is true about people's lived experience?
Oh gosh, well, on one level, we would still have a market economy, so that would not change. We'd still have all these private enterprises that we deal with. I'm not averse to state-owned enterprises, but they're not essential. Let's put it that way. But the big differences would be, one, people would have a guaranteed monthly income, which would, I don't have to explain this to you, change their lives just in giving them a sense of security, which they could build on. And an enormous reduction of the stress of everyday living. And the confidence that nature was being protected. So you add all those three things together, and you can feel, well, we actually have an economy that serves all the people and protects nature at the same time. I think that would increase happiness.
I think so. And I think even more so, I like to dream about Keynes's essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren.
Yes.
Where he basically said, he hinted at, we need non-labor income.
Yes.
To complement people. So much automation, and eventually we'll get to 20-hour work week because people will want to work, not because they have to work, because they want meaning and purpose in life. And if we don't co-own nature's value, I don't see how that will ever be possible, because here in Canada, we see rents have gone up 10% in the last year. Just the value to access basic needs will keep getting more expensive unless the profiteering motives on our basic needs, on the environment particularly, is addressed. Separating profits from innovation, which people have a right to, from profits from just possession, which we think of as commonwealth. So thank you very much for your book. And
well said.
Yeah, let's open things up to the audience.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Peter and Floyd. I think those are some of the most important ideas of our generation. In the chat box, you can see a link to Slido Q&A, where you can add and vote on questions. And we've got quite a number added here already. And thanks to those of you who've contributed by typing questions and uploading them. So the most upvoted question we have here from Anonymous is, if trusts have legal obligation to future generations, would that not necessitate completely shutting out the current generation, given the realities of climate change? Wondering if you have any thoughts on that, Peter.
Yeah, briefly. Okay, the trusts would have kind of dual fiduciary responsibility. One to future generations, one to living generations. Sometimes those responsibilities might conflict. Living generations might want to burn more oil and dump it into the sky, but future generations might want to have, a stable climate. So what do you do? My proposition is that the responsibility to future generations comes first. Use of whatever the ecosystem is would have to be based on what is sustainable, peer-reviewed science, and that trumps any desire for present generations either to have more resources or to have more income. So once you've satisfied the fiduciary responsibility to future generations, the trust would then take whatever revenue was generated and divide it equally. That would be fulfilling its function or responsibility to living generations.
That's a really interesting point, Peter. And I think we actually see it empirically in real life, the balance or imbalance between prioritizing the well-being of future and current generations is actually manifested in the differences between Alaska and Alberta's wealth funds. Where Alaska and Canada, we also have a Quebec Generations Fund, which is predominantly funded by hydro revenues. And Norway, they all share the quality of super prioritizing the future generations, the long-term wealth building. Whereas in Alberta, its real value over time has actually eroded because a lot of the returns actually were spent for near-term priorities. And so in the real world, we actually see what you just said, Peter, playing out in real time.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
So the next question is, I think, a very interesting one and a very important one. In your view, does indigeneity confer one with additional or different inherited universal property rights in settler societies?
Well, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I am thinking more universally than in terms, so indigenous people are included, obviously, but whether they get preferential treatment or not, I don't have a strong view on it. But I guess my preference would be
Beyond Meat's at $74 a share.
Yeah.
Pardon? There are, I mean, I should mention as an aside that within the US, there are a few cases where native tribes whose main asset nowadays is casinos, take the profits from the casinos and distribute it equally to their members. That's an interesting model. But whether that would apply when the asset is a universal asset, I don't know. I'm inclined to not open the door of, distinguishing between subgroups when you have a universal
energy.
program. Pardon?
So we're just gonna mute everybody right now and proceed. Robert, Robert Tilden, if you could mute yourself. Thank you. Go ahead. Okay. Yeah. And in Ontario, there's an Ontario First Nations Sovereign Wealth Fund. which
Mhm.
operates for the benefit of First Nations communities here. And
Mm.
there is a large ring of fire, rich rare earth discovery north of Ontario, worth $90 billion or north of that. And the province is in talks with First Nations communities around it to see how it could be part of that, could be stewarded for the benefit of local Indigenous and First Nations communities.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a forest in Wisconsin, the Menominee Forest, which is owned by the Menominee tribe, and they do a really great job of sustainable logging and paying dividends to their tribal members as well. So lots of possibilities there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we'll go to the next question, which is around law and government. Given the role wealth plays in accessing the levers of law and government, our universal property, in parenthesis, should we erect toll gates for their use too?
For the use of government or the courts or something? I'm not
Yeah,
sure I understand the question.
yeah, I'm interpreting it in that way as well. Given the
Uh,
role wealth plays in accessing government.
I'll have to pass on that. I really don't know. I've not thought about
Mhm.
that.
Yeah. All right, we'll move on to the next one. This one is referring to applying these principles around the world. How might these principles be applied globally?
Mhm.
Should money pumps distribute locally or universally, carbon fees from largest emitters to global south, etc.? And I think the more general, broader question here is how could we coordinate at a international scale or a continental scale to really solve these problems more efficiently?
Right. Well, that has been, since the Rio Convention in 1992, which was full of, nice, pious talk, but not didn't have the mechanisms. I think negotiating an international agreement that would satisfy everybody from Saudi Arabia down to some island state in the Pacific Ocean and so forth is probably not possible. I wish it were, but I don't think it is. But there is an alternative, I think, which is not as neat and clean, but maybe the best we could do, which is that if a couple of large economic areas, such as the US or North America or the European Union, I don't imagine either India or China would do this first, but let's say either the North America or the EU were to, and I'm just talking about climate here, were to put a nationwide or EU-wide limit, as has been actually done in the EU, and included in this system of a regional cap with regional dividends. And also the key missing, or the key other feature would be what are called border adjustment fees. So the problem with getting all the countries in the world to agree to something before you move forward is that, we don't have enough time for that. But if a couple of major blocks would start and put border adjustment fees around their blocks, what would happen is, let's say China would have, if it wanted to export goods to, let's say, the EU with this kind of a fence around its atmosphere, they would have to pay a border adjustment fee, which would raise the price of Chinese exports in Europe, which would make them less competitive. And on the other hand, what it would also do, or at the same time, such a border adjustment fee system would essentially compel China and other exporting countries to put their own prices on carbon that were roughly equal to the border adjustment fee, so that that money, instead of going to Europe, would stay in China. So you create a very serious financial incentive for everybody to join the system once you started the system with a couple of major importing economic regions. That's the best answer I have to that question. It's a tough one.
Wow. And I think that would be a pretty good starting point for international and continental cooperation, right? Because these are tough challenges and we can't, you might say that the weakest link will hold us back, right?
Yeah.
Around the world. I want to go to one question that we haven't really touched on much yet, which is around IP rights. Have you looked at intellectual property rights as part of our shared wealth? And I'll add to that as a way to fund universal dividends.
I have briefly in this previous book, the Liberty and Dividends for All, but I haven't had much to say about it, except that it's a potentially huge source because of the explosion in the value of intellectual property in the last 50 years, much of which has been a result of government investment in one thing or another. But even leaving that aside, it's obvious based on artificial intelligence and everything else will be, really tied to intellectual property. And I think that, that needs to be thought through in a way that's above my pay grade. But I definitely believe there can and should be systems for charging the users of intellectual property, particularly, private intellectual property owners, they have their rights, but there ought to be rights for common intellectual property owners. How to set that up is, as I say, above my pay grade, but I am sure there is a way to do it.
Mm-hmm. And there's a growing interest in the idea of AI dividends, or dividends from technology-enabled profits or economic rents. And in California, there's a project called the Digital Data Dividend Program.
Right.
So I think increasingly this will emerge as a bigger priority in people's minds. Yeah. So this is a question around the biosphere. If we're operating well beyond the carrying capacity of the biosphere, do you think people will stand for trusts enforcing those limits?
Well, that's the ultimate question. The whole point of tying dividends to the limits is precisely to address that question. If you didn't have dividends, I would say there is no way people would stand for having limits. I think the only conceivable way that we could make this work and endure over time is by linking the limits to dividends.
Yeah, and the next question here is from Stefan Horn, who actually gave a talk on economic rents several months ago for a Commonwealth community call. Very glad you could join us here. Stefan asks, are there existing examples of local asset-specific Commonwealth funds? Do you need guidelines to ensure that local funds are acting in the common interest?
Well, do you consider the Alaska Permanent Fund, or there are some examples out there. Not enough. Go out and make some more.
Yeah, and one question that this stirs up for me is whether that is a good strategy for setting up Commonwealth funds through local assets and the smaller scopes. You mentioned in your book that you might imagine a package of carbon rebates, financial transaction fees, and corporate share levies as a as a subset of all the Commonwealth, of all the funding sources that we could use to build up a universal property trust, and then having that expand as political support grows over the years.
Right. I don't think any of this is going to happen in one fell swoop. And I think, I mean, looking historically how major changes occur, they usually start small and local or state or provincially, and then ripple out and eventually get adopted at a national scale. So it's really even Social Security in the US, I looked into the history of that, and that started at a state level and you know, worked its way up. So I think that's a good way to go. I think it's going to be a while politically before there's enough support for these ideas at a national level, where also the vested interests tend to be the most powerful. So starting locally makes a lot of sense to me. And just building.
Stefan here.
Yeah.
And Stefan says he meant non-state actors, community
Non-state actors.
initiatives, including community land trusts, which I think are
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, mostly non-state actors. I mean, there are thousands of small local land trusts in the US now. It's a real movement. And I don't know that any of them are paying dividends because their primary focus, or some of them are for affordable housing. I mean, there's a whole variety of them, agricultural land trusts and so forth. So there's a whole movement out there already, which only lacks the dividend component, but that can be added. I mean, the basic building blocks can be created without any national legislation.
I want to acknowledge that we're already past the hour, so the official end has completed, and so if you need to leave, feel free to do that. But as always, we like to stay as long as people want to chat and continue proceeding with questions. And so the next question comes from a user named Ophelia. And perhaps this could be a question, Floyd, that you might have some ideas on. Why would these ideas work in Canada specifically?
Well, Peter started the talk saying he thinks they're more likely to happen in Canada.
Right.
Well, in Canada, I think we're a very progressive country. We're a resource country, so I think talking about natural resources can go further here. And also, we have a lot of crown land. So even if that could be leveraged for leasing and redistribution, there's just a yeah. And I think the housing crisis right now puts certain things in spotlight. I think those are some reasons. I mean, anyone else? I'm sure you have opinions as well.
And at this point, if anybody wants to chime in or has an answer for any of these questions, you can raise your hand. There are a good number of experts on UBI and economic rents here with us today. Yeah, here's a question from me, which is, do you think land rents are a good way to fund a social wealth fund or universal dividends? Because you've mentioned other types of revenue options, and I'm curious about your thoughts on land.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I read Henry George 50 years ago or something, and it blew my mind. And I have always I believed his analysis of how rent is like a wedge that divides people in the economy is absolutely spot on. But that said, I also live in California, where about, I don't know how many years ago now, 30 years ago, there was something called Proposition 13 that passed overwhelmingly that froze property taxes at their 1975 level or something like that. And it's still on the books. It's a disaster, but the idea of raising, even if it's just the land tax and not the building tax, but the idea of raising property taxes as a way to lower housing costs is kind of counterintuitive. And I think people would have a hard time getting it. So I don't know. I mean, I'm agnostic on land value taxes, not as a theoretical. I mean, if this had been done, if the land value taxes had been enacted in the 19th century, when Henry George first proposed it, that would have been fabulous. But given where we are today, where housing costs are so high and such a sensitive issue, I just have my doubts about the political viability of it.
Mhm. That's a really important discussion to continue having, I think, especially the basic income community. We draw from the wisdom of Thomas Paine as well as Henry George. Both of them advocated for dividends from ground rent. Even Henry George, who was very much for a single tax from land, admitted that he did support Thomas Paine's idea of social dividends, especially where there's a surplus from above government expenditures.
Right. I mean, I did see one or two. I'll shut up because I see somebody else's hand.
Hi, Bill. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, just you brought up, I can't remember her name, Blayforth, the woman with the Doughnut economy book. I read it recently, and something else, a theme that I see coming up in these conversations is this idea of starting small. That was something that she mentioned too. She saw the idea of her Doughnut economy not being implemented by a province, a state, a nation, but rather by cities. And I believe Copenhagen was an example of hers where they were starting to implement it. I'm just wondering, there always seems to be a lot of intellectual discussion around this. And I'm just wondering how we support these ideas in a more activist way. How do we sell the people that are more the doers rather than the talkers to do this, rather than on a national level, on individual levels like this? Many wonderful examples have come up here. I'm wondering how we sew those together, how we string those together, how we come up with some way of using media, social media, hashtags, whatever it might be, so that when we talk to people about this, we can send them out and say, look at all these examples of where this is working, where this is making a forest better, where this is making housing affordable for a group of people, where this is paying dividends to Indigenous people from monies made by a casino. I guess that's kind of my question or my reflection after hearing this over and over again in these meetings.
Lloyd, why don't you take that on?
So that's what we're doing with Commonwealth and UBI Works. And I mean, UBI Works, we're really good at activism. At Commonwealth, we're not doing activism yet. We're mostly doing information and social media and raising awareness and building the policies, which you can see on our website as they're being developed.
Yep.
But I'm totally with you. We're very active oriented and we could use your help.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Ken?
All right. Here's a question around governance of trusts. Have you considered the governance of the trusts you suggest? For example, citizens' assemblies.
Right. My feeling about the governance of trusts is that the most important piece of that is the fiduciary responsibilities to future and living generations. That has to be absolutely watertight. Whether how the trustees are selected or appointed, whether it's election by citizens or appointment by public officials or sort of a what's the word, self-perpetuating board like many nonprofits have. I don't think there's one answer, one size that fits all. I think flexibility is the right approach, and Yeah, but the important thing is to get the fiduciary responsibility locked in. It doesn't matter to me if the fiduciary responsibility is locked in. It doesn't matter to me so much how the actual trustees are selected. I don't know which method is superior to any other.
Yeah, and in Canada, we might draw an example from our pension fund management model, where it's independent of the government, and that for that reason, it's our pension funds are technically not sovereign wealth funds because they operate independent, at arm's length from the government, with an independent board and an independent and a management. And Guy Standing writes that a commons fund could have a democratically elected governing board even that represents a cross-section of society and even stakeholders of the commons, which I think is a very interesting idea.
I do. I mean, I agree. There may be some persons on boards of trustees who represent other species or future unborn generations. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, because as you say, Peter, there are ecosystems for which there are no representatives in the market, right? And so the meta economic problem we have to solve is to give them a voice and align markets with those ecosystems.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think the question of governance actually may be one of the most important to get right.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. So here's a question around for you, Peter. Are there any champions within any USA government elected politician? If so, what is their story? And I'm curious about what the story is with Congress members who have really bought into your idea.
Well, there's not a lot is the short answer. There are a few, and I can't really, the cap and dividend bill or legislation was introduced, 12 or 13 years ago by several senators, but obviously didn't pass, and is kind of not going anywhere at the moment. More recently, I mean, as you were mentioning about Canada during the COVID years, lots of new things popped up, including a refundable child tax credit, which was ended a couple of months ago. But while it was in existence, it was wildly popular. And there are many Democrats who are pushing to make a refundable child tax credit permanent now. It might, I don't know. Our politics is so messed up. I have no idea. But there are more, the Overton window, if you know what that is, about what issues are now sort of vaguely within the window frame of political viability, has shifted in since some of these ideas were first proposed. I mean, cap and dividend legislation was introduced 2009, right after Obama was elected. So what's that, 14 years ago? And yes, because of COVID and the climate crisis and everything, the Overton window has moved. It hasn't moved far enough, but it is inching in the right direction. And it's really your job to push it even further. But just in that context, I would add that I don't, having been a sort of modest student of history, I don't think these changes will occur on a significant scale unless there is a major crisis of some sort. The Depression brought in much of the social insurance legislation that we have now in the United States. We got Medicare in 1964, which was kind of a fluke because of the Johnson landslide victory over Goldwater, but we've not been able to get anything significant since then. Even during the financial crisis of a couple of years ago, it was a completely wasted crisis. So big picture, I think you have to keep grinding away and, within the current Overton window to keep pushing that as much as possible, developing local and state models and working out some of the unanswered theoretical questions, like you said, about governance, for example. So that's what we can do now. But we also have to sort of prepare for the next crisis, which is probably not that far off, and have a strategy. This is what the conservatives do. They're all ready for crises, and then Milton Friedman and his boys just move in and get shit done, during that brief moment after a crisis. We should be also prepared to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that's why I think a lot of the work ahead of us is around advocacy and shifting that Overton window. Because I think that the ideas that you've presented, Peter, they stand up to scrutiny. There's a lot of economic and scientific evidence backing it. We just need to get the word out and spread this message far and wide. And that's why we're hosting this call and doing events like this today.
Right.
Yeah, this is a question for Floyd, Ken, Liam. If there's any other Canadians here that might be able to have some insight on this, feel free to chime in. Is or are there any notable economists in Canada researching and writing, speaking on Commonwealth as a policy option for Canada?
Well, Ken, you want to summarize what you read from David Green?
Yeah, there's a UBC economist from the Vancouver School of Economics who actually was the chair of the BC Basic Income Panel, and he in his paper he said that economic rents, which are excess profits from monopolies or resource extraction or pollution that harm society, are actually possibly the best option to fund a sovereign wealth fund. On one hand,
I don't understand.
And I'm just going to mute everyone. Yeah, and he also makes the argument that increasing returns from technology, which result in greater and greater returns to capital and the access to technology, machines, actually are a very strong argument for a sovereign wealth fund as well. And he approaches it from the frame of distributing these returns on economic rents, on the argument that this really should belong to, should be returned to benefit the community rather than to rents that are captured privately.
And much has been written about rents overall, about EM spectrum, about the oil rents. But there's no economist, to my knowledge, that is advocating for these things. We heard of Jack Mintz. He talks about royalty regimes from rents, but they're not talking about Commonwealth as in like everyone getting dividends. So, we hope in our work to make relationships with academia to share these ideas, and hopefully we can find people come out in public to talk about the benefits of this approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the final point on that is that many members of the basic income community actually came to this through the Commonwealth lens. It happens to be that the forefront today in government and in a lot of the advocacy is around cash transfers as a way to address poverty, especially targeted cash transfers to help those who are at or below the poverty line. And that's a very worthwhile fight to be having. But as you can tell from the names UBI Works and Commonwealth, many of our supporters came in first with a passion for dividends from wealth that belongs to all of us. And actually, a lot of our work is inspired by language from Peter yourself. Co-inherited wealth. These are ideas that we want to spread far and wide. So we're hoping that economists that there are quite a few economists that do write about basic income, and we're hoping that through our work we can shift the Overton window more towards the commons.
Here's a question that is in a Slido that I've often gotten as well. doesn't make polluters pay still allow wealthy people and corporations to continue to pollute our planet? And then a similar question I've gotten is, well, if we're all getting dividends off of pollution, then aren't we going to want more pollution because we're profiting off of it? I'm curious how you'd respond, Peter. And I believe you're on mute.
Sorry about that. First question about rich people being able to pollute more. Yeah, they will. That's what it means to be rich. You can do that. But what you would wind up with, there'd be a decreasing amount of aggregate pollution. Within that aggregate, rich people will be using more than poor people, but they'll be paying for that right, and poor people will be becoming less poor in the process. I think that's the best you can do. You can't really individually limit people based on their incomes or something like that. What was the second part of the question? Will there be an incentive to keep polluting because people are getting dividends? That is a concern. That is a legitimate concern. But I think what I tried to explain this earlier. There's sort of a counterintuitive thing going on here, where if you want to get more dividends, the way to do that is to lower the limit rather than raise the limit, because lowering it creates more scarcity, which raises the price, which leads to more revenue. There will come a point where, when the limit is way, way low, where people might, where that kind of counterintuitive effect might no longer happen, and there'd be more revenue if you raise the limit. But so I think part of the challenge here is to make sure that the dividends have multiple revenue streams, not all of which are based on pollution. And we've talked about what those various other revenue streams might be. So that would alleviate the pressure that might come at some point to allow more pollution.
Okay. Well, I think we're near the end of the questions now. I might impose upon you, because we started the recording after you answered the first question, and I'm sure the audience wouldn't mind hearing you answer one more time. What is universal property? Could we ask the question again for the recording?
Sure. Universal property is just another word for commonwealth, with the slight difference that it brings in the element of property and property rights and the universality of those property rights. Whereas sometimes commonwealth, is vague about actual ownership rights.
Okay. All right, we'll try and run with that. Thanks for the recording.
Very much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys. It's been very interesting, and I'm so impressed with what you're doing in Canada. I've got to say, there's a lot going on in the US, but most of it is very, single issue specific, and you're taking a really broad, long-term approach, which I think is wonderful. So carry on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're building.
Hey, Mr. Barnes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You might find it interesting to pay attention to Detroit right now.
Okay.
The mayor of Detroit is all in on land taxation, 100%. He's bet his whole career on it.
Uh-huh.
And he is getting rid of taxing your house, but taxing your land instead, which is what you seem to be promoting. And it's either Pittsburgh or Philadelphia that have already started that, which has generated a brand new revival of their downtown because the taxes have changed and the landlords have already understood that sitting on dead land is not worth the money.
Mm-hmm.
Because now the land is being taxed, not the thing on it.
Right.
So it's just intriguing reading for those particular 2 or 3 cities.
Thank you. I will keep an eye on Detroit.
Robert, I believe you're referring to the split tax rate proposal that Mayor Mug Duggan in Detroit pitched recently. Actually, there are a few candidates in Canada, political candidates that are actually running on that policy. The idea of untaxing your home and shifting that tax onto land values would shift the incentives away from punishing productive development and construction, and shift the incentive towards more productive and better uses of land as a way to combat blight and revitalize the economic downtown cores of these cities. And so a lot of politicians and policy wonks are kind of watching Detroit right now to see if this works or not, because I think if it does, then there will be many other cities that will follow suit. Yeah. So thanks a lot for bringing that up, Robert. And yeah, with that said, I think this may be the most questions we've ever had submitted from our audience. And as you can tell, Peter, there's a great amount of interest in your ideas and how we can spread these ideas and make them more mainstream. And I'd like to ask if you'd like to share any final words of wisdom on this.
Well, I guess I don't know how wise this is, but taking a long-term perspective, keeping the long-term in mind is kind of important, because this is a struggle that isn't going to be won quickly. And also what I said earlier about getting ready to act quickly in a crisis, if and when it occurs, I think is a useful thing to be working on while you're doing all these other things you're doing.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I think that will definitely inspire our work going forward. Yeah, all right. And thanks to everybody who stayed all the way for over 90 minutes to hear from Peter Barnes. And we will have this recording uploaded and shared. So in case you want to watch it again or share it with anybody who couldn't join us today. And we'll also be making clips out of this for you to share online as well.
I just wanted to thank you. I wanted to point out this poster on my wall here, which is one of my great acquisitions. It's from the 1936. The headline is "A Monthly Check to You." It was put out by the Social Security Board that was formed in 1935 or 36, and they wanted to get every American to register for social insurance. Go down to your post office, and then you will get a monthly check for the rest of your life after you turn 65. I would love to see more of that happen. Go make it happen.
All right.
All right.
Yeah, take a picture of that. We'll put that on social media. That looks great.
Yeah.
If we could tie that narrative to different forms of commonwealth and natural resources.
Yeah.
If the Canadian government decided to tie that narrative to the carbon rebate,
Mm-hmm.
it's not just a incentive for polluters, it's a check for you as a citizen of
Amen. Yeah.
Great ending. All right.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
guys.
All right, thank you very much.